Douglas strides into the graduation hall. Tanya glowing in white beside him, both radiant with the confidence of people who believe this entire ceremony was staged for them. Douglas whispering, visibly pleased with himself. Today, the whole world gets to see how far we've come. A quiet ripple moves through the crowd heads, turning in one direction. Douglas glances up and goes completely still. Carol walks in navy dress, gold earrings catching the light. Spine perfectly straight, and standing beside her is James Calloway. Voice dropping, fingers tightening around Douglas's arm. Is that Calloway Capital? Douglas says nothing. His jaw locks shut. Later, a quiet hallway after the ceremony. Douglas steps in front of Carol, voice low but pulled tight at every seam. Douglas. Carol. When did you and Calloway? Carol turning to face him, calm in a way that cuts deeper than anger. I've always been exactly who I am, Douglas. You just couldn't see it when I was busy making myself smaller to fit the shape of us. Silence. Then Douglas looks at her for the first time all day. His control slips, just barely. Douglas, barely above a whisper, like a confession he didn't plan to make. You look exactly like the woman I thought I was marrying when I was 27. Carol says nothing. She turns and walks away without looking back. Narrator. He spent months engineering this day to show the world he had moved on. His ex-wife only needed one phone call at 8:30 in the morning to rewrite the entire story. This is the tale of a woman who wore gray for 14 years, and the day she finally chose color, everything changed. Keep watching to find out what really happened. Don't wear the gray one, Ruth said it from the doorway. Her arms were folded. Her coffee was in her right hand. She was looking at the gray dress on the hanger. The way you look at something you have already decided is a problem. Carol turned from the mirror. It is appropriate, she said. It is invisible, Ruth replied, and you are done being invisible. Carol looked at the dress. Then she looked at herself, 52 years old. Brown eyes. A small scar on her chin from a bicycle fall when she was 9. Her hair was the dark auburn it had always been. Threaded now with silver, she had stopped fighting 3 years ago. She had learned to think of those silver threads as honest, not a defeat, a record. She was still recognizably herself after everything. That was something worth noting. The room smelled of Ruth's coffee and the lilac candle Carol burned every morning. Pale light came through the curtains. The bed was made. The closet was open. The gray dress hung there, waiting. She reached past it. She took the navy blue one. Not because Ruth told her to. She stood in the morning light of her own bedroom. A bedroom she had chosen herself. In a home she had built herself. On the salary of a company she had founded herself at 46 years old. She looked at the gray fabric. She thought one clear, careful thought. I wore gray for 14 years. I wore gray to every school fundraiser and every company dinner. I wore gray to every Saturday afternoon where I made myself quieter so he could be louder. I wore gray until I forgot I owned other colors. Not today. She stepped into the navy dress, zipped it, stood straight, exhaled once, let it out, let the morning settle around her. Ethan's graduation was at 2 o'clock, her son, 22 years old. Mechanical engineering degree from a school he had earned his way into on merit alone. A scholarship his junior year that he had called to tell her about before he called anyone else. A boy-turned-man who phoned her every Sunday without being asked, who remembered her coffee order, who had driven 4 hours in a rainstorm once because she sounded sad on the phone, who arrived and had not made a single thing of it. Her son, and today was his day. She had promised herself she would not let anything ruin it. She had made that promise every day for 4 weeks. Since the seating chart email arrived from Douglas. Formal, efficient, written with the particular Christmas Douglas applied to every logistical matter. Family Section A, Douglas Whitfield and guest. And guest. She had known about Tanya for 4 years. She had known the name for 2. She had seen one photograph, blurry, from a mutual friend's social media feed, the kind of accidental evidence that arrives before you are ready for it. Blonde hair, wide smile. The easy radiance of someone who has not spent a decade and a half trying to become smaller. Knowing and seeing were different things. Today she would see. Carol opened the jewelry box on her dresser. The small gold earrings that had been her mother's. She put them in slowly. Watching her own hands in the mirror, steady, steadier than she expected. The gold caught the morning light. Something about that small brightness made the steadiness easier to hold. You doing okay? Ruth called from the kitchen. Fine, Carol called back. That was not entirely true, but she was something better than falling apart. And that was its own kind of accomplishment on a complicated morning. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Something shifted in her chest in a way she had not expected at 8:30 in the morning. Not anxiety, something more specific than that. James Calloway. She had been expecting his call in the abstract, in the way you expect things you have been thinking about. She had not been expecting it now. She sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up. James, she said. Carol. His voice was the same as it always was, unhurried. The voice of a man who had made enough consequential decisions in his life that he no longer needed to perform urgency. I have a question that isn't about business. She tilted her head. In 6 weeks of working conversations, he had never prefaced anything that way. All right, she said. I'll be at the graduation today, he said. Ben Harlow is my godson. I have attended every significant event of that boy's life since he was 4 days old. Today is not going to be the exception, she had not known. Ben Harlow was one of Ethan's classmates. They ran in overlapping circles without being close. She had not connected the two worlds. I didn't know you were Ben's godfather, she said. Ben mentioned your son in the spring, James said. The load distribution thesis. And then I realized, a pause that contained something she could not quite name. I also know that your ex-husband will be there with his girlfriend. Ben's family knows the Whitfields. He told me the situation. Another pause. I'm not calling to insert myself. I'm calling because I want to ask you something directly, and you can say no. Carol was quiet. The lilac candle burned on the nightstand. She could smell it. Outside the window, a bird was beginning to work on something. Small and persistent and certain. I think you should walk into that ceremony with someone beside you, James said. Not because you can't do it alone. You absolutely can. But because you shouldn't have to walk into a room that has been arranged against you without someone standing on your side of it. He let that sit for a moment. I'll be there regardless. I'm asking if you'd like company. She pressed her lips together. She thought about the email with its clean coordinating sections. She thought about what Ruth had told her 2 weeks ago. That Douglas had been talking about bringing Tanya to the graduation for months. That he had mentioned it at the club. That 3 people who knew Carol happened to have memberships there. That Douglas had framed it as a natural next step, a debut. The way people introduce a chapter of their lives when they want the chapter witnessed. She thought about being invisible. About gray dresses. About walking into a room that someone else had organized and finding your seat in it like a courtesy. You have been offered a choice. The thought arrived without drama. Just say yes. Yes, she said. A brief silence, then he said, good. I'll meet you outside the north entrance at 1:30. I'll be there, she said. She hung up, held the phone in both hands for a moment. The bird outside was still at its work. The coffee smell from the kitchen had grown richer. Something about the ordinary persistence of both those things steadied her. Ruth was in the doorway. She had heard enough. Her coffee was suspended in the air, forgotten. Who was that, Ruth said. Not as a question. James Calloway, Carol said. Calloway Capital. He is Ben Harlow's godfather. He will be at the graduation. Ruth lowered the coffee cup very slowly, and he asked if he could walk in with us. Carol met her best friend's eyes in the mirror. I said yes. Ruth was silent for 4 full seconds. Carol had known her for 20 years and could not recall a 4-second silence from Ruth Hensley under any circumstances whatsoever. Then Ruth said, the navy dress. She said it like a verdict, absolutely the navy dress. And she went back to the kitchen to refill her coffee with the contained energy of a woman exercising considerable self-restraint. They arrived at the university at 1:28 in the afternoon. The main quad was already filling. Families in their best clothes. Grandparents with cameras that were too complicated for them. Siblings in dress shirts they had ironed themselves. Badly. Mothers in heels on grass who were already regretting it. The beautiful ordinary chaos of a milestone completing itself. The air smelled of cut grass and heat and someone's flowers somewhere nearby. A jazz ensemble was playing near the east entrance. Carol could hear the horns carrying over the crowd noise. She had always loved that particular sound. The way a horn could hold warmth in an open space. He was at the north entrance before them. Dark charcoal suit. Simple. The particular understatement of something very expensive. He was finishing a call when their car pulled up. He saw them. He ended the call without ceremony and came toward them. He opened Carol's door. Not as performance, as matter of course. She got out. They looked at each other in the afternoon light. Carol, he said, with the particular weight she had noticed in their first meeting, like he had decided her name was worth saying carefully. James, she replied. She extended her hand. He shook it, warm, present, without the absent-minded quality of a handshake doing something else. He looked past her. You must be Ruth, he said. Ruth stepped forward with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for approximately 45 minutes. The best friend, she said. The one who told her the navy dress was non-negotiable. James looked at Carol, then back at Ruth. Good call on both counts, he said. He said it simply. Not as flattery. As a plain statement of fact. Ruth's expression was something Carol would think about later, in quieter moments when she was trying to understand what the day had given her. They walked in together. The crowd adjusted around him. Not with drama, nothing announced. But people made way the way water makes way around a stone, slightly, without effort, because the weight was there. Carol noticed it and filed it away. She was not thinking about Douglas. She was thinking about her son, somewhere in that procession, in his black graduation gown, with his cap at its characteristic angle. That was what she was here for. She held on to that thought through the crowd noise and the heat and the sound of the horn section lifting into the May afternoon. She held on to it. She had worked for 22 years to be holding exactly this. The crowd thickened near the entrance gates. Carol felt the warmth of the afternoon on her arms. She could smell sunscreen and someone's perfume, and the particular dusty scent of a lawn that had not been watered recently enough. James was to her right. Ruth was to her left. The seating marshals were directing families through two side entrances. She breathed. She thought about Ethan, the way he always turned his cap at that same angle. She thought about the first day she dropped him at kindergarten and he walked through the door without looking back. She had cried in the car for 11 minutes. She had told nobody. She breathed again. The grief and the pride were the same feeling. She had learned that somewhere along the way. They were not opposites. They were the same thing wearing different expressions on the same face. She walked through the gate into the full, shining, ordinary afternoon of her son's greatest day. She did not look toward family section A. She did not need to yet. The seats were good. Carol settled into hers. Third row from the front, left of center, angled perfectly toward the processional path and the stage. Ruth sat on her left. James sat on her right. The folded program was stiff in her hands. The jazz ensemble was still playing somewhere behind them. She had chosen not to think about Douglas's section until she was seated. She was seated now. She let her eyes move. Family section A was center, 8 rows, 3 across the processional route. Douglas had chosen well. Anyone walking the processional path would pass within 20 feet. Anyone scanning the family seating from the stage would see that section before any other. She understood this, not bitterly, as a fact. The way you understand the architecture of something you have lived inside long enough to see its bones. Douglas Whitfield had spent his professional life choosing seats. She had been sitting beside him in those chosen seats for 23 years. She knew the geography of his ambitions. She could read his choices the way she read his jaw, the way she read Ethan's shoulders. She did not see him yet. She filed that awareness away and looked at the program instead. Ethan James Whitfield, mechanical engineering, with distinction. With distinction. She said the words quietly to herself, not aloud. Just a private saying of something you need to let land before it can mean what it means. They always bury the honors in the program, Ruth said quietly, like it's something to be modest about. He worked 4 years for those 2 words. Carol replied. He did, Ruth said. And you worked 22. Carol did not respond to that. She looked at the program. She let the words sit where they belonged. She found out later how long and how deliberately it had all been arranged. She gathered the picture piece by piece, from Ethan, who told her parts of it carefully, from Ruth's network of mutual friends, who told her other parts, and eventually from Douglas himself, in a hallway at the restaurant, when the day was almost done and the pretending had run out of places to go. Douglas Whitfield had lived 2 lives for 4 years. His post-divorce life had been rebuilt with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything. Tanya was warm. She was blonde. She was 38. She had none of the particular history that Carol carried. Douglas had kept the 2 worlds separate. His old friends from the marriage saw him as someone moving on quietly. His new life with Tanya existed in a clean compartment with no windows facing the old one. The graduation was meant to end that. He had decided somewhere in the preceding months that it was time. Time for Tanya to enter his complete world. Not just the new one, the one that included his son, his mother, his college friends, the people who had known him as a husband and a father. He had told his assistant in front of colleagues. The graduation would be the occasion. He had told Margaret, not as an apology, as an announcement. He had told Ethan weeks in advance. Ethan had replayed the phone call to Carol in a voice that was careful and diplomatic. Every careful word told her how hard her son was working to protect them both. He had reserved the private dining room at Harlow's 2 months ago, 12 seats, center of the room, the chair at the head of the table. He had chosen the seating chart deliberately, Section A center position, visible from the processional route. The table at Harlow's would be the private dining room, 12 seats, center of the room. He had approved, apparently, of the white dress. Carol learned this last detail from Ruth. Ruth had heard it from a woman who knew someone in the restaurant's event planning office. The way these things travel in a world where 2 people who were married 23 years share more social geography than either realizes. More mutual friends, more intersecting circles, more people who know both halves of a story that only ever gets told in pieces. White to a graduation. The choice of someone who wanted to be the lightest, most visible thing in the room. Carol understood this. By the time she assembled the full picture, she understood it the way you understand something that no longer has the power to hurt you the way it once would have. Douglas had planned a statement. He had organized a room. He had arranged the day to say something specific about where he was and what he had chosen. And Carol had chosen navy blue. She had answered a phone at 8:30 in the morning. She had said yes before she could think herself out of it. What the room saw was two people walking in together who had no need to announce themselves. That, it turned out, was enough. She did not see Douglas's reaction directly. She was moving through the family entrance area. She was talking to James about something she would later remember only partially. Ben Harlow's choice of chemical engineering, if she remembered correctly. She was half listening to herself and half listening to the crowd, and then her eyes found Douglas, the trained reflex of 23 years. He was near the section entrance. Tanya was at his elbow. He was speaking to someone Carol did not recognize. He had the ease of a man who is comfortable being watched. Then he registered them. She knew the exact moment, because Douglas Whitfield, who had spent 30 years learning to control the expression on his face, and who was very good at it, went briefly and unmistakably still. Tanya, who had been laughing at something, looked up. She felt the stillness. She followed Douglas's gaze. She too went quiet. Carol looked away before either of them could recover. "Is that the Harlow boy?" she said to James. She pointed toward the procession area with complete composure. "3 rows in," James replied. "Yes. Ethan said they had a statistics class together sophomore year," Carol said. "I know," James replied. "Ben failed that class the first time through." She laughed. Genuine. Unexpected. The first unexpected laugh of the day. She filed it with the others. She was beginning to understand that unexpected laughter was what the day was going to give her, instead of the things she had prepared for. The thing about planning for pain is that you build a very specific version of it in advance. Carol had spent 4 weeks building her version. She had imagined the white dress in detail. She had rehearsed the sight of Douglas and Tanya together in a public space. She had practiced feeling nothing that showed. She had prepared for the hollow, metallic sensation she associated with things Douglas did that were designed to be seen. What she had not prepared for was this, the morning phone call. The yes she said before she could stop herself. The warmth of this man's unhurried presence. The way the day had arrived with an entirely different architecture than the one she had built in preparation. She had not prepared to feel large. She had prepared to feel adequate. Those were not the same thing. She was beginning to understand how far apart they actually were. She looked at the field, at the rows of empty chairs waiting for the graduates, at the stage with its clean white cloth and its flowers, at the sky, which was the deep May blue that happened only a few days a year when everything lined up correctly. She thought about Ethan. She thought about the Sunday phone calls, the coffee order, the 4-hour drive in the rainstorm, the boy who had grown into a man so quietly and so completely that she sometimes caught herself surprised by him all over again. Her son, 22 years of everything, was walking toward her in a black cap and gown. And whatever Douglas had planned, whatever the white dress was meant to say, whatever Family Section A had been arranged to communicate, none of it could touch what was about to happen. Her son was about to graduate, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. You know this feeling. The one before the thing you have dreaded finally arrives. The way your body prepares for impact, even when the impact may not come. Even when the real thing turns out to be smaller than the version you built in your head. You have sat in those rows. You have held that program. You have told yourself you would feel nothing, and then felt everything and been surprised by the shape of it. You have worn the gray version of yourself to rooms that asked for more. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you chose differently. Maybe you chose color. Maybe you let someone stand beside you when it would have been easier to refuse. Maybe that was where it started. Not the dramatic moment, not the confrontation, not the look that crossed the quad and landed on a man's face like a verdict. The small yes in a quiet bedroom on a complicated morning. That yes, that was where the whole thing began. The music started at exactly 2 o'clock. A brass quartet somewhere to Carol's right launched into something formal and warm. The crowd noise fell. Parents straightened in their seats. Someone to Carol's left said something and was hushed. The particular collective attention of several thousand people resolving into a single direction. The processional began. Black gowns, mortarboards, young faces still carrying the last residue of the people they had been at 18 before 4 years reshaped them. They came in 2 columns, steady and slow, the way ceremony asks you to move, not like life is usually lived. Carol watched each face, looking for the one she knew from every angle, the one she had watched learn to walk, to read, to drive, to grieve, to get back up and keep going. And then, there he was. Ethan Whitfield walked onto the field. Black gown, mortarboard at its characteristic angle. The angle it always had because Ethan was constitutionally incapable of wearing anything on his head correctly. She had told him this every Halloween for 18 years. He had never once adjusted. She had stopped expecting him to. She felt it. The particular expansion in the chest she had no better word for than this. Loving your child is a physical condition. It does not recede. It lives in the body like a weather system that simply is. She was on her feet before she knew she had stood. He was scanning the crowd, eyes moving across the rows, and then he found her. She watched his face in the moment of finding, the recognition, and then his eyes moved with great deliberate casualness to James. The grin froze, traveled back to Carol. She gave the smallest possible shrug, one shoulder, a millimeter later. His face cycled through approximately 5 distinct expressions in 4 seconds. He landed somewhere between disbelief and something that looked very much like delight. He pointed at her. The finger gun he had done since he was 12 years old, like she was the best thing in the room. Then he collected himself, looked forward. She could see from this distance that he was working very hard not to laugh. Ruth, on Carol's left, was studying the program with intense concentration. James, on Carol's right, was watching the procession with the quality of attention she had noticed in their first meeting. Not performing interest, not half present, simply there. "Which one has been?" she asked quietly. "Third row, far left," James replied. "The one adjusting his collar." She found him, tall, light brown hair. The expression of someone who has been awake since 5 in the morning and is running entirely on adrenaline and determination. "He looks terrified," she said. "He has been terrified since last Tuesday," James replied. "He called me 4 times. You answered," Carol said. "Course I answered," he replied, simply. Like the idea of not answering had not occurred to him. She sat with that for a moment. The particular quality of a person who shows up, who answers, who considers it obvious that you answer when someone who needs you calls. She had not always had that quality present in her life. She was beginning to understand how much it mattered, how its absence had shaped things without her fully recognizing the shaping. To her right, Family Section A was visible at an angle. She did not look. She did not need to. She could feel, in the way you feel the presence of a weather system before it arrives, that she was being watched from that direction. She chose not to give it her attention. She watched her son walk across the field and take his seat. The ceremony unfolded. Speeches she would remember only partially. A dean whose cadence was soothing and whose specific words dissolved in the afternoon air. A student speaker who had clearly spent months writing something and delivered it with the terror and courage of someone saying the realest thing they could manage in a public space. Carol listened and did not listen. She was watching Ethan's shoulders from 300 feet away, the particular set of them when he was interested in something. The slight forward lean when the student speaker said something that landed. She had been reading his shoulders since he was 4 years old. She could still read them from across a quad. When his name was called, she did not need to be told. She was already on her feet. "Ethan James Whitfield," the reader said. "Mechanical engineering, with distinction." She was standing, applauding. She did not know when she had stood. The sound around her was enormous and she was not hearing it. She was watching her son walk across the stage, watching him take the diploma from the dean's hands, watching him turn toward the families. James was standing beside her. He applauded like a man who meant it, not politely, with the actual energy of someone who has decided this moment deserved his complete attention. On the stage, Ethan raised his diploma, briefly, not for the photographers. She knew the difference. He raised it for her, and his eyes found hers across 300 feet of spring afternoon and held for 1 second. She felt it land in the place where all the real things land. She was still standing after the moment passed. Ruth took her hand, just for a second. The grip of a woman who has been in your life for 20 years and knows when to hold on and when to let go and has never once confused the two. She was not going to cry. She had promised herself. She held it. The recessional came after. The same columns, now graduate columns, filing back through the center of the field. Ethan passed within 30 feet of their seats. He found her again. His expression this time was different. Not the grin, not the disbelief. Something quieter. The face of a young man standing on the other side of something he worked 4 years to reach and is only now beginning to understand what that means. She mouthed one word at him. He read it, smiled, the private one. The one that had been just for her since he was old enough to have 2 smiles. Then he walked past. The crowd began to break. The jazz ensemble somewhere started up again. Everyone suddenly talking at once. The peculiar relief of ceremony returning to life, to noise, to the ordinary human business of finding each other in a crowd. Carol sat for a moment after everyone around her began to stand. She had been thinking about her son. She had been thinking about nothing else for the last 2 hours, and the remarkable thing she would understand later was that she had been unable to think about anything else. Section A had existed. The white dress had existed. The planned debut had been proceeding 25 yards to her right the entire time, and she had not been able to focus on any of it, because her son had walked across a stage and she had been completely, entirely there. She remembered the hospital, the particular institutional smell, the weight of him, 7 pounds, 11 ounces, the way he had looked at her, the look that babies have when they are not quite here yet, not quite gone from wherever they came from. already himself, even then. She remembered his first day of school, the backpack that was too large for his body, the way he had not looked back. She remembered the Sunday calls, every Sunday, without being asked. His voice the same voice he had always had, just changed in the way voices change without you noticing until one day you notice and cannot unknow it. She had done that, through everything. Through the 14 years that ended and the 3 years after. Through the rebuilding and the grief and the particular loneliness of becoming yourself later than you wanted to. She had been his mother through all of it, and he had grown into a man who called every Sunday. That was what she had done. That was worth something. That was worth everything. She found Ethan at the fountain. He came toward her through the crowd with the energy of someone who has been waiting for this moment and does not quite know what to do with his body when it arrives. He hugged her first. Long. Completely. The way he had hugged her since he was 4 feet tall. The kind of hug that means, "I know this day was complicated and I love you for showing up anyway, and I am so glad you are here, Mom," he said, into her shoulder. "I know," she replied. Because she did, he stepped back, looked at her. His eyes moved, with great deliberate casualness, to James Ethan. Carol said, "This is James Calloway, Ben's godfather. We have been working together for about 6 weeks." "Working together," Ethan repeated, in a tone that indicated this phrase was being filed immediately for close examination at a later date. James extended his hand. "Ethan, your mother told me about the load distribution thesis. The grain silo structural analysis." Ethan's expression changed. Something opened in his face. "She talked about the thesis," he asked. "She is proud," James replied, simply. "It comes up." Ethan looked at James for a long moment. The particular look of a young man who has spent years watching his mother be underestimated and is now recalibrating something important. Something he had not known needed calibration until this precise second. "Yeah," Ethan said slowly. "It is solid work." He shook James's hand with the grip of a man who has decided something. "Are you coming to dinner tonight?" Carol opened her mouth. "If your mother would like that," James said. Looking at her, she looked at James, then at her son, then at the afternoon light on the quad. "Let me think about it," she said. Ethan's grin was immediate. It told her everything about what he thought the answer would be. "I will take that as close enough." He squeezed her hand. "Give me 20 minutes. I have to find Connor." He moved toward the crowd with the practiced diplomacy of someone raised by 2 parents who separated carefully and never asked him to choose. She watched him go and felt the particular complicated pride of a parent watching a child who turned out better than the circumstances deserved. And then, in her peripheral vision, she became aware of Douglas crossing the grass. He was moving with purpose. Tanya had stayed behind. Carol noticed this. It was intentional. She recognized the particular angle of Douglas's walk when he was making a move he had thought through in advance. She had seen that walk in board meetings and difficult conversations and late-night arguments that had nowhere left to go. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, he simply looked. At Carol, at James, back at Carol. She watched the calculation behind his eyes. The brief inventory of a man absorbing information and deciding how to respond to it. "Carol," he said. "Douglas," she replied. Even. Warm enough to be civil. Nothing more. He looked at James. A beat in which Carol understood that Douglas Whitfield was deciding whether to admit he recognized a name that everyone in their professional world knew. Deciding whether to pretend or to acknowledge. "James Calloway," James said. He extended his hand. No edge to it. No performance. The ease of a man who had nothing to prove and knew it. Douglas shook it. "Douglas Whitfield," he said. "I know," James replied pleasantly. "Your son is extraordinary. You should be proud today." Douglas absorbed that. "I am," he said. Because whatever else he was a father who loved his son. That was never the question. That had never been the question. He looked at Carol again. The question that had no dignified way out of it was written on his face. "When did this happen?" "We have been working together for several weeks," Carol said. "Smooth. True." "Of course," Douglas replied. His voice was impeccable. His jaw was very slightly tighter than it should have been. She knew that jaw. She had watched it for 23 years. She could read it the way she could read Ethan's shoulders. The way you learn to read the people you have lived alongside long enough. "Ethan is looking for you," Carol said. He had the cap at the usual angle. Something eased in Douglas's face when she said that. The particular softening that happened whenever Ethan was mentioned. It had always been the truest thing about him. The part of him she had never doubted. "Yes," he said. "I should find him." He looked at Carol one more time. Something moved behind his eyes. Something older than either calculation or composure. "You look," he started. He stopped. He chose differently. "Enjoy the afternoon," he said. He walked back. Ruth appeared at Carol's elbow before Douglas had gone 10 steps. "He looked," Ruth said. "Like a man who has just realized the narrative of his day has been rewritten." "Don't," Carol said. "I am recording history," Ruth replied. "I will say nothing editorially. I will simply note that Douglas Whitfield has not had that expression on his face in the 4 years I have had to look at it. What expression? Carol asked. Ruth tilted her head. Like he lost something, she said, and did not know it until right now. Carol looked across the grass. At Douglas, who had found Ethan and was hugging him. At Tanya, who was watching the hug with the expression of a woman trying to find her place in a scene that predated her by 22 years. She felt the things she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Grief. The quiet, private kind. For the loss of the man he used to be when he was capable of that kind of clarity. For the years between then and now. For all of it. For the waste of it. For the parts that had been real and the parts that had eroded and the long, diffuse process by which a marriage becomes something neither person fully intended. She breathed, let it move through her, then looked at her son, smiled. People in the crowd knew James Calloway. She noticed this in the post-ceremony minutes as they moved through the families. Not loud recognition. This was not a man who attracted scenes, but the quiet double-take, the calculation behind people's eyes, the slight lean toward each other that meant names were being exchanged in low voices. She watched two of Douglas's banking colleagues from across the quad. She watched the moment register in their expressions. She watched them process what they were seeing. She had not planned any of this. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She had said yes to a phone call because she was tired of walking into rooms alone. That was the whole of it. There had been no strategy, no calculation. Just a yes at 8:30 in the morning when the alternative was no, and no felt like one more small surrender. Whatever the room saw was incidental. But she would be lying to herself if she did not feel it. The slight shift in the atmosphere. The way the afternoon had arranged itself into something she had not known she was building toward. She felt for the first time in a very long time. Exactly the right size. Not larger than she was. Exactly the size she was. That was different. That was the whole difference between confidence performed and confidence inhabited. She stood near the fountain while the crowd moved around her. The water made its small, continuous sound. Someone had planted geraniums in the concrete bed around the base. She could smell them in the heat. She let herself just stand. Afternoon was beautiful. She was 52 years old. Her son had graduated. She was wearing the navy dress. She had said yes this morning to something she had almost refused. She was here, completely here. She let herself feel that without immediately moving on to the next thing, without filing it away for later processing, without performing the feeling or minimizing it. Just a woman standing at a fountain on her son's graduation day, feeling, for the first time in a very long time, that she was actually present in her own life. That was not nothing, that was everything. It was Tanya who found her, not Douglas, not Margaret, who had arrived at some point and was holding court near the seating area with the focused energy of a 78-year-old woman who had decided that aging was something that happened to other people, and she saw no particular reason to be included. Tanya. Carol was speaking with two of Ethan's professors. They were warm, enthusiastic academics who wanted her to know that her son was the kind of student you do not forget. She was absorbing every word of it without apology. She was letting it land in the place where it belonged, not performing modesty, just receiving what was true. She felt a presence nearby. She turned. Tanya Graves was standing a few feet away. Alone, she had come across the grass by herself. She had broken away from a conversation that Carol could see Douglas was still in. She had the expression of a woman who has decided to do something difficult before she can talk herself out of it. Up close, she was younger than the photograph. The blonde hair was natural. Carol was close enough to tell. She was pretty in a direct, uncomplicating way. And she was nervous. Visibly, unmistakably nervous. The kind of nervous that does not perform itself. That simply is. "Could I have a moment?" Tanya asked. "I know today is already." "I know there is a lot." Carol excused herself from the professors. She turned to face Tanya fully. "You must be Tanya," she said. "Yes," Tanya replied. She inhaled. "Let it out." "I don't know how to do this. I have thought about what I would say and it all sounds wrong. So I am just going to say it plainly." She looked at Carol directly. "I didn't know how today was going to feel until I walked onto that quad. I have never been in the same room as you before. And standing here, I understand things I should have thought about before." She paused. "I am not asking for anything. I just want you to know this is your son's graduation. That should be about him. I am sorry if I have made today harder than it had to be." Carol looked at her. She had built a version of Tanya in her head over 4 years. The version that helped her be angry when anger was useful. The version that made the leaving make sense. A particular kind of betrayal rather than the long, diffuse failure it actually was. That version was easier to deal with than this. A real woman. Nervous, decent, trying. "It is Ethan's day," Carol said. "I am here for him. I think we can all manage that." Tanya let out a breath. "Thank you," she said. She hesitated. "He talks about you all the time, Ethan. He called me once to tell me about a campaign you had won. He just wanted someone to know how proud he was." She paused. "He showed me the Meridian Health work. He said, 'That is my mom.'" She met Carol's eyes. "I thought you should know." Carol stood very still. Ethan had shown her work to Tanya. He had called this woman his father's girlfriend. The woman who had existed for 4 years in the category Carol had been trying not to think about, and he had shown her his mother's work. Because he was proud. Because he wanted someone to know. That was who he was. She had raised that. Thank you, Carol said. Quietly, meaning it. Tanya nodded, moved away. Ruth was there before Tanya had gone 10 steps. What did she say? Ruth asked. She apologized. Carol replied, and she told me Ethan showed her my work. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked after Tanya. Her expression moved through several things Carol could not entirely read. That is not what I expected, Ruth said. No, Carol replied. Me neither. She looked across the crowd, found James talking with Ben Harlow's parents, laughing, at ease in the way people are easy with each other when the relationship is old and uncomplicated. She watched him for a moment. Thought about the particular relief of meeting someone whose presence does not require you to manage yourself, whose attention does not cost you anything to receive. Then she looked at Douglas. He was watching her from across the grass, not with anger, not with the composure she had expected, with something older than either, the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of a plan that had turned out to be smaller than the situation. She looked away. She thought about the dress, the phone call, the yes. I wore gray for 14 years, she thought. Not today. The hour before dinner was the quiet middle of the day. She and Ruth sat near the fountain while James spoke to Ben's parents. Ethan migrated between family clusters with the practiced diplomacy of someone raised by two people who were trying very hard and had mostly succeeded. She thought about what she was feeling. She had expected something sharper. She had spent weeks steeling herself for the visual of Douglas with Tanya, for the white dress, for the deliberate staging of a debut she had not been consulted about and would not have been able to stop. She had prepared for pain. What she actually felt was more complicated than pain, and less violent. She felt clear, like something that had been filmed over had been cleaned away. She could see what the last 14 years were now, not at their best or their worst, but their actual structure, who held the weight, who had pretended to, where the scaffolding had been arranged and by whose hand she had pretended in her own way. She had told herself she was choosing peace when she was choosing invisibility. She had told herself she was being flexible when she was being erasable. She had spent years making herself the appropriate size for a marriage to a man who needed to be the largest thing in every room. She did not blame him entirely. She had made choices too. Every year, a small one, every room a smaller one. A long sequence of small choices that added up to the shape of something she had not intended. Until one morning she had put on a navy dress and said yes to a phone call and walked into a field where her son was graduating. She let herself feel the anger now, not perform it. Not perform the opposite either. Just feel it. She had given 23 years to a life built on the premise that her largeness was a problem, that her growth was a threat to something, that the appropriate response to a husband who was afraid of what she was becoming was to become less. She had believed that premise for a long time. She had swallowed it so completely she had stopped noticing the swallowing, had mistaken the swallowing for peace, and then one day she had not believed it anymore, and the whole architecture had shifted. The anger was not at Douglas alone. It was at time, at the particular waste of years spent becoming smaller than she was. Years she could not get back. Years her son had watched without understanding what he was watching and had carried with him into adulthood anyway. She breathed through it, let it move through her without closing around it, did not let it close her. She sat at the fountain and let the anger be what it was. Not permanent, not the whole story. Just a feeling passing through a person who had finally stopped pretending not to have feelings. Then it passed, and what remained was something cleaner. Harlow's was what you would expect of Douglas's choice. Dark wood. Candles set deep enough in the table that their light was intimate. White linen. The particular hush of a restaurant that has decided silence is a luxury worth charging for. The menu had no prices. That was not an accident. Nothing about Douglas's choices was accidental. The private dining room was off the main floor. 12 seats, a single long table. Douglas had reserved it 2 months ago. Carol arrived at 6:55 with James and Ruth. 2 minutes early. She believed in being precisely on time for things she was apprehensive about. The waiting always made it worse. She had learned this early and had not forgotten. The room smelled of beeswax and something herbed in the kitchen. The candles were already lit. The glasses were filled with water. Someone had put small arrangements of white flowers at the center. She noted the flowers and let them be flowers. The room was half filled. Connor Bradley, Ethan's roommate, was talking at speed about something technical with one of the professors. 2 of Ethan's classmates who had been invited because Ethan constitutionally could not exclude people from any event without suffering about it for days. And Margaret Whitfield was seated at the chair immediately left of the head, hands folded on the table. She had the expression of a woman who had attended 78 years of dinners and had ranked this one as one requiring careful attention. She looked at Carol when they walked in. Then she looked at James. Then she looked back at Carol. Well, she said, that was all. But from Margaret, who had spent 78 years perfecting the art of saying everything with nothing, it was an entire paragraph. Douglas and Tanya arrived 4 minutes later. Douglas had composed himself by then. She could tell from the evenness of his posture, the smooth way he moved to his chair, the particular control that Carol had always respected even when it frustrated her. He was a man who could gather himself completely and show nothing. She had watched him do it for 23 years across many different kinds of tables. He greeted her with warmth exactly calibrated. Carol, a nod to James. Calloway Douglas, James replied, the same pleasant nothing, no edge, no ownership, just civil. Tanya sat beside Douglas. She was quieter than she had been at the ceremony. She wore a different expression now. The dress remained. The expression was the one of a woman navigating more carefully than she had planned to, finding the contours of a room she had not fully anticipated. Carol took the chair across from Margaret. James sat to her right. Ethan arrived last, still in his gown over his clothes, still grinning, with the energy of a man who had been waiting for this particular gathering his whole life and was not entirely sure how to feel about the version of it that had materialized when he wasn't looking. He sat down, looked around the table, found Carol. She smiled at him. He smiled back. The private one. The real one. Just for her. We are okay, it said. All of us are okay, whatever this is. She picked up her menu. Dinner moved the way complicated dinners do. In islands. Connor told a story about Ethan's first week of college that made the whole table laugh. Even Margaret, who seemed mildly surprised at herself. The professors talked about graduate school options with the enthusiasm of people who believe deeply in the project of education. Douglas ordered wine for the main table. Something expensive. Carol recognized the label without looking. The conversation settled into multiple smaller conversations, the way a river splits when it meets an obstacle, adapts, finds new paths around the thing in the center. James was completely himself. She watched this with the clarity of someone observing it in real time. He asked Connor about his plans. He listened to the answer without performing listening. He asked one of the professors about her research into composite materials. He leaned forward slightly when she answered. He told a story about Ben Harlow learning to fish at age 6 at the Callaway's Lake House in Maine that made Ethan laugh until he nearly knocked over his wine. He did not perform. He did not manage. He occupied the room the way he occupied every room, as himself, completely, without apology or effort. It was the rarest thing she had seen in a long time. She found herself watching Douglas watch James, not with malice, with the particular quality of observation of a man who is recalibrating, who understands he has walked into the day expecting a story to unfold a certain way, and has found the story already written differently. Tanya, beside him, was kind to Ethan. She asked him about the thesis with genuine interest and listened to the answer without reaching for her phone. She laughed when appropriate and said nothing when silence was better. She was trying. Carol had decided at the fountain to let that count for something. She held to that decision. It was Margaret who spoke. Margaret waited until the first course was cleared, and the table's conversations had broken into separate pools of sound. Then she leaned toward Carol with the precise intent of a woman who has decided to do something and is doing it regardless of who is watching. He looks at you, Margaret said. Carol did not pretend not to understand. We are working together, she replied. We have known each other 6 weeks. I didn't say he knows you, Margaret replied. I said he looks at you. She picked up her wine. Her hands were spotted with age, but they were steady. Douglas used to look at you that way. Before he stopped. I could never pinpoint when he stopped. I kept thinking he would notice what he was doing. She set the wine down with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that this particular movement should not be rushed. He didn't. Carol held still. I was unkind to you during the marriage, Margaret said, and after. I told myself I was protecting my son. But the honest version is that I didn't want to see what I was watching. It was easier to make it about you, Margaret. Carol began. Let me say it, Margaret said. I have a 78-year-old's prerogative to say what I have been putting off. She looked at Carol with the directness of someone who has outlived the need for indirection. You built something, that company, that life. You raised that extraordinary boy while building a career that most people spend 40 years on. She paused. He made a mistake. I know it. He knows it, though he cannot say so, and I am sorry I was part of what made you feel you had to be smaller than you are. The table noise continued around them. No one else was hearing this. Carol felt the words settle in some deep and specific place, the place where the old pain lived. She felt it move, not disappear, just shift, loosen slightly, like something that has been held too long and is finally being set down. Thank you, she said simply. Don't thank me, Margaret replied. I am late. Late apologies are the bare minimum. She glanced sideways down the table to where James was saying something that made Connor and Ethan both laugh at the same time. "That one," she said. "He sees you, Margaret." "I know. I know," the old woman said. "Business." She picked up her fork. "The fish is very good here," she added, with the particular composure of a woman who has said what she came to say and considers the matter settled. "You have done more than you were given credit for. You have carried more than anyone thought to acknowledge. The record of it exists in the man at that table who calls every Sunday and shows your work to people he wants to impress. The record exists, even when no one was reading it, even when you yourself forgot it was there. Even then, it was there." She stepped out between the main course and dessert. She had needed a moment, not a crisis, just air. The particular stillness that comes after a day that has asked a great deal. The dinner had given her more than she had planned for. Margaret's words. Tanya's apology at the fountain. The sight of Douglas watching James with that recalibrating expression that she recognized and could not entirely name. Too much. Not too much to hold. Just too much to hold while pretending to eat fish and talk about composite materials. She found the hallway outside the private room. Quiet. The particular quiet of a service corridor in a good restaurant, where the noise of the dining room arrives only as a muffled warmth through a closed door. She stood against the wall, let her head rest back, closed her eyes for one moment, let the day settle. She could hear the kitchen somewhere distant, the clink of plates being moved, someone's laughter, brief and professional, the particular sounds of people doing their work. She opened her eyes and heard his footsteps. She knew them. 23 years of walking beside someone writes their footsteps into your muscle memory. You do not forget. You do not get to forget. She straightened. Douglas stopped a few feet away. He looked at her for a moment. The hallway was quiet enough that she could hear the restaurant behind the door and nothing else. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she replied. He pressed his lips together, found his words with the deliberateness of a man who does not often lack them and is unsettled by the lapse. "Callaway, you and Callaway, that is. We are building something together," she said. "A healthcare communication platform. I am the co-founder on the creative side. It is early stage." He nodded slowly. That was not the question. She knew it. "I meant today," he said. She waited. "I planned today," Douglas said. He said it without pride, with the flatness of a man acknowledging a fact about himself that does not reflect well and has decided to acknowledge it anyway. "I planned it for a long time. The dinner, this restaurant, all of it," he exhaled. "I wanted everyone to see that things had moved forward, that I had moved forward." He looked at the wall to his left. "I told myself I was just introducing Tanya properly, but I know what I was doing." She waited. "And then you walked in," he said. "And I." He stopped again. She let the silence hold. She had learned in 3 years of building her own life that silence has weight and uses, that filling it too quickly is its own kind of fear. "You look like yourself," he said. Finally, for the first time in years, maybe longer, he looked at her directly. "You looked exactly like the person I thought I was marrying when I was 27 years old." She held. "That I have been myself for a while," she said. "I think you just could not see it when I was trying to fit into the shape of us." He flinched, barely. She caught it. "I was afraid," he said. "I know that doesn't help anything. I was afraid that you were growing and I was standing still. And instead of telling you that, instead of doing anything useful with it, I found a way to make it your fault that you were growing." He exhaled slowly. "I found Tanya, and I told myself it was about her, but it was about me being afraid of what you were becoming." She looked at him. She had waited 4 years to understand this. She had spent enormous energy in the early years being angry, in the middle years being sad, in the recent years being something more functional and less raw. She had constructed theories about what had happened and dismantled them and rebuilt them. She had told the story to herself in many different configurations. And here it was. As simple and as human as that. Fear, the thing that hides underneath almost everything that goes wrong between people who love each other. "I believe you," she said. He blinked. "I am not forgiving everything," she said. "The way it happened, the lying, the secrecy, the years of it. I am not there yet, but I believe that you were afraid, and I believe it hurt you too, in different ways." She paused. "We were not bad people. We just stopped growing in the same direction." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the kitchen sounds more clearly, long enough that the restaurant behind the door shifted in its sound to something lower and more settled. "She is good," he said, meaning Tanya. "She is a good person. I am not performing that. She is good and she tries, and she deserves someone who is actually present." He looked at Carol. "I am trying to be." "Then be," Carol said. "Simply, commit. If you are going to love someone, actually do it. Do not make her carry what you could not give me." He stared at her. "We built Ethan," Carol said. "Whatever else we did or did not do, we built that extraordinary man in there. That counts, for both of us." She picked up the glass she had carried from the room and set on the side table near the door. "Go back to your dinner, Douglas." He nodded, then quietly. "He is good to you, Callaway." We barely know each other yet, she said. Even so, Douglas said, I can tell. He went back through the door. She stood in the hallway alone. She had not expected to feel what she felt. Not satisfaction, something quieter. The particular piece of a conversation that has finally said the things that needed to be said. 4 years overdue, in a restaurant hallway on their son's graduation day. Between two people who had been married long enough to know each other's footsteps and had never quite managed to say the simple, true thing until there was nothing left to protect. She thought about the man she had married at 27. The version of Douglas who had been capable of looking at her the way James looked at her today. The version who had once understood, before fear got in the way, that her growth was not a verdict on his adequacy. That man had existed. She had loved him. She had built a life with him. Those things had been real, and then something had shifted, and neither of them had known how to say so. And here they were in a hallway, saying it now, late but said. She stood there for another minute, breathing, letting it all be what it was without trying to make it something else. Then she went back in. You have had that conversation, or something like it. The one where the person who hurt you finally says the simple human thing underneath all of it. And you discover that the simple human thing is both less and more than you expected. Less because it does not undo anything. More because it is true, and truth, even late truth, has its own particular weight. You were afraid, he was afraid. That is not an excuse, it is an explanation. There is a difference. Knowing the difference lets you put down the part you were carrying that was never yours to carry. Just that part. The rest is yours. The grief is yours. The lost time is yours. You are allowed to hold all of it. And you are also allowed to put down what was never yours. She made it to the parking lot before she stopped moving. Not because she was going to cry. She had promised herself she would not cry today, and she was keeping that promise, though it was costing her something to keep it. The way the promises you make to yourself always cost something when they matter. She just stopped, stood between two parked cars in the warm night air, hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. The restaurant sounds faded behind her, voices and cutlery and something playing softly in the main dining room. The particular hum of people finishing their meals. Out here, the night. Warm. The particular warmth of a May evening that has held its heat past sunset and is not yet done with it. A distant car alarm somewhere across the lot. The smell of asphalt and something blooming in the planters near the entrance. The small, persistent sounds of an ordinary evening. She stood in it. She thought about Douglas's face in the hallway. You looked like yourself. For the first time in years, you looked exactly like yourself. She had been herself for 3 years, quietly, without announcement, building Whitfield Creative from her kitchen table, then a rented desk, then a real office with her name on the glass, hiring Sarah, winning the Meridian contract, learning to sleep alone in a king-size bed without feeling that the absence of another person was a verdict on her value. She had been herself. But she had been being herself in rooms that did not require the full version to be visible. Rooms that were only asking for part of her, where the full version could stay in the background and still do the work. Today, something had required the full version. She had brought it. That was the whole story. That was the whole story. She stood in the parking lot and let herself feel the size of it. Not as triumph, not as relief, as something quieter. The particular feeling of recognizing yourself in a mirror when you had not been expecting to look. The door opened behind her. Footsteps she recognized. Ruth, with Carol's jacket over one arm. She held it out without saying anything. Carol put it on. They stood in the parking lot in the particular silence of 20 years of friendship. The kind of silence that is its own conversation, that has its own grammar and its own punctuation and does not need filling. You did good in there, Ruth said. I said what was true, Carol replied. That is the hard part, Ruth said. She looked at the restaurant windows, the warm light inside, the shadows of people moving. He said, you looked like yourself. He did, Carol said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Douglas Whitfield, she said slowly, spent 14 years watching you make yourself smaller, and it took someone else standing next to you to make him see what he was looking at. She paused. I am not going to say what I want to say about that. Thank you, Carol said. I am noting it privately, Ruth replied. With the particular restraint of a woman who has been noting things privately for 20 years and has a very full notebook, the door opened again. James. He walked toward them carrying Carol's wrap. She had left it over the back of her chair and had not noticed until now that it was missing. He held it out, simple, no ceremony, no performance of thoughtfulness. Your son, he said, is now explaining to the professor the load-bearing mathematics of the Eiffel Tower. She appears genuinely interested. I thought you might want a moment. Carol laughed, the third unexpected laugh of the day. She had stopped counting somewhere around the second one and had not gone back. She took the wrap. You did not have to come out, she said. No, he agreed. She looked at him. In the parking lot light, in the warm night air, the particular quality of this man, The way his presence was never a performance and never an absence. The way he simply was, completely, without the parts you had to accommodate or apologize for. "What did you think of today?" she asked, honestly. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He was not a man who gave quick answers to real questions. She had noticed this in their first meeting and had filed it under things to trust. "I think," he said, "that you have spent a very long time being seen by people who were not paying full attention." He paused. "And that you have spent the last few years becoming someone who does not need anyone's attention to be real." He met her eyes. "Today, for the first time, you were in the same room as yourself. The complete version." Another pause. It was worth seeing. She stood very still. Ruth made a sound beside her that she would later classify as the most restrained sound Ruth Hensley had ever made in Carol's presence in 20 years of close friendship. "I will have my attorney send the partnership documents Monday," Carol said. Her voice was almost entirely even. James's expression curved. "Of course," he said. "I also want to move the Providence onboarding timeline forward," she said. "I think we can compress the first phase by 3 weeks." "I agree," he said. And she started. She stopped. He waited. With the particular patience of a man who has learned that the thing someone stops before saying is often the most important thing they have to say. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For this." A gesture at the parking lot. "The night. All of it. For calling this morning." He held her gaze for a moment. The particular quality of being looked at by someone who has decided you are worth looking at carefully and is not in a hurry to look away. "You have been waiting to be seen," he said. "I just happened to be looking in the right direction." Ruth's hand found Carol's arm and squeezed it. Hard, without a word, Carol breathed. "Let us go back in," she said. "I want to hear my son finish his Eiffel Tower theory." They went back in together. This is what quiet strength actually looks like. Not the dramatic moment, not the triumphant speech, not the look that crosses a quad and lands on a man's face like a verdict. Those things happened. They were real. But that was not the strength. The strength was this: standing in a parking lot after a day that asked everything. Accepting a rap from someone who thought to bring it. Saying thank you out loud to the person who saw you, meaning it. Strength is this small. Strength is choosing to go back in, back to the table, back to your son. Back to the full, present, warm, complicated human evening of your own life. Not away from it. In. That is where the strength lives. In the returning, she called him on a Tuesday. She had almost called on Monday. Then she had been genuinely buried in work. The Providence proposal, which she had decided on the drive home from the graduation to expand in scope. Targeting the full patient communications suite rather than just the materials phase. The conservative version had felt, in the light of the day she had just lived, like wearing gray. She had written the full proposal. It had taken everything she had for 3 weeks. She had been glad of that. Work that takes everything is useful work. "There is no room left over for the things you are still trying to understand," she called on Tuesday. Second cup of coffee. Rain on the office windows. The particular sound of rain against glass, which she had always found useful for thinking. Sarah was already at her desk in the next room. The office had the morning quality of a place that is ready to begin. He answered on the second ring. "Carol Whitfield," he said, like he had been expecting it. Like the wait had been exactly the right length. "James Calloway," she said. "I told you I would be in touch." "You did," he replied. "You are nothing if not a woman who means what she says." She could hear the smile in it, the particular warmth of it. "Where are you?" "My office," she said, watching it rain. "I am in a car on the way to the airport," he replied. Terrible timing. A pause. "How are you?" The question was simple. He said it with the weight that meant he actually wanted the answer and would wait for it. "Better," she said. "I have been thinking." "Productive or circular?" he asked. "Mostly productive," she replied. "Some circular. I have been thinking about what you said in the parking lot." "What part?" he asked. "That I was in the same room as myself for the first time," she said. She looked at the rain on the glass. "I have been thinking about what it looks like to stay there. To not drift back into the appropriate version." A silence. Traffic behind him. Faint, the sound of him thinking. "What does it look like?" he asked. "I pitched the Providence network at full scope," she said. "Not the conservative version I had planned, the full version, the one that would require twice the resource and twice the nerve." She looked out at the rain. "I went in and I talked about my cousin, breast cancer, 2 years ago." The folders of information she brought home from the oncologist's office. The way the language was written for someone who had already spent 4 years in medical school. The way she looked at me the day she said, "I do not understand what they are telling me." She paused. I told them that was the gap, not the science, the translation. And I told them I knew how to build the bridge. James was quiet for a moment. "Did you win it?" he asked. "I do not know yet," she said. "They are deciding Friday. You will win it," he said. "You cannot know that," she replied. "I know the quality of the Meridian campaign," he said, "and I know what you just described to me. Personal experience and professional expertise in the same room. That is rare. Most people have one or the other. A pause. You have both. You have always had both. You just had not yet found the room where they fit together. She held that. I want to meet, she said. In person, not a call. I want to talk about the co-founder structure properly. And I want to discuss what the next phase looks like if Providence says yes. I am back Thursday, he said. Lunch. Thursday is good, she replied. I will make a reservation, he said. Somewhere quiet. And Carol, yes, she said. Come ready to talk about what you want from this, he said. Not what is reasonable, what you actually want. She pressed her lips together. Something steadied in her, the particular steadying of a person who has been given permission to want what they want and is still slightly surprised by it. I will do that, she said. She hung up, sat in the quiet office with the rain on the windows. Sarah typing steadily in the next room. The normal sounds of a working day. The coffee growing cold in the second cup. She sat with the possibility of Friday. She had learned, slowly and not without cost, that certain things you have to let be possible before you can let them arrive. She let Friday be possible. Her phone rang at 3:14 on a Friday afternoon. She was mid-sentence on a brief when the email notification appeared. Providence Health Network. She stopped. She set down her pen. She opened it. Dear Ms. Whitfield, on behalf of Providence Health Network, we are pleased to inform you that your proposal has been selected. The full scope engagement has presented. We look forward to beginning our partnership. She set her phone down very carefully on her desk, like it was made of something fragile, like the weight of it mattered and deserved to be treated accordingly. Then she put her hands over her face and cried, right there, alone, with the rain gone and the late spring afternoon light coming through the window at that particular angle you get in May when everything lines up correctly. Not sadness, not grief, the specific, profound relief of being exactly right about yourself and then finding out that the version of yourself you chose to trust was the correct one, that the full proposal was the right proposal, that the voice that said go further was the one worth listening to. She cried for approximately 45 seconds. Then she composed herself, took a breath, looked at the ceiling for a moment, let the moment finish being what it was, picked up her phone, called Sarah. Sarah, she said, clear my Thursday lunch, reserve the good conference room for Friday morning, and order champagne for the team. Sarah's voice, carefully controlled. Good news, we won, Carol said. She told Ethan on a Sunday. He came for lunch the way he always did. She made chicken marsala from the recipe in her mother's green notebook, the one she had brought from the house she had left and placed in the drawer of the house she had built. She had not cooked from it in 6 months. She had decided it was time. He ate 2 helpings. He told her about the job offer in Chicago. A good firm. Interesting projects. The opportunity to specialize in the things he had written his thesis about. She was happy for him and carrying, privately, the particular bittersweet of a mother watching her child's life accelerate in the direction it was supposed to go, and knowing the acceleration will not slow. After lunch, at the table with coffee, she told him everything. The Providence win, the co-founder conversation. James. She kept it businesslike at first. He listened the way he listened to things that mattered, without interruption, eyes moving through the information, building a picture. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Callaway Capital, he said slowly. Yes, she replied. Mom, he found the word he wanted. That is not just big. That is the kind of thing people build careers hoping for. It is early stage, she said. A lot could still. It will become something, he said. With the certainty of someone who knows the person making it, you will make it into something. He put his mug down. You have been waiting for this. Not for him specifically. For a problem big enough to need everything you have. She looked at her son. You are perceptive, she said. I have been watching you for 22 years, he said simply. I know what you look like when you are working at partial capacity, and I know what you look like when you are all the way in. He met her eyes. That conversation with Dad, he told me about it. She went still. He did, she said. At breakfast the day after the graduation, Ethan said. He looked at his hands for a moment. He said you looked like the person he thought he was marrying. A pause. He said it like it was something he had only just understood. Like he was still working out what it meant, Ethan. I am not asking you to feel anything about that, he said quickly. I am just telling you, he looked up, because I want you to know. I see it too, the change. You have been different for 2, maybe 3 years. But that day, at the graduation, he shook his head. You were just completely there, the whole time. She felt the pressure behind her eyes, did not let it go. James, Ethan said carefully. Is he? Is this just business, she said. And possibly something else, slowly. He nodded. Processing. Is he good to you? I have known him 6 weeks. Even so, he said. He looked at her directly. Is he? She thought about the parking lot, about the rap, about you have been waiting to be seen. I just happened to be looking in the right direction. About the quality of a man who could say a true thing and then go quiet and let it land without asking to be thanked for it. Yes, she said, he is good to me. Something settled in Ethan's face. The decision of someone who has been watching out for someone else and has concluded they can. Cautiously, stand down, not entirely, but partially. Enough. I want to meet him properly, he said. Not as a surprise at my graduation. An actual introduction. I will arrange it when the time is right, she said. Take your time, he said. Then, grinning. But not too long. I'm going to need to vet this man. She laughed. The fourth unexpected laugh. She had lost count so many times by now she had stopped trying to keep it. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. The same hand she had held in every hospital waiting room, every school parking lot, the back seat of the car the morning she drove him to college for the first time. I love you, she said. I love you too, he said now. Serious question. Do you have dessert or do I need to save room for the Italian place on 5th? She laughed again and again. She was not going to count anymore. This is what transformation actually looks like. Not the speech, not the confrontation, not the moment the room shifts. Those things happened. They were real. They mattered in the way that real things matter. But transformation looks like this. A Sunday afternoon with your son, chicken marsala from your mother's green notebook, coffee going cold on the table, a young man who calls every week sitting across from you, watching you with 22 years of love in his eyes, asking if the man in question is good to you, telling you he sees the difference. This is what you were building toward, not the win, the arriving, being exactly where you are, completely present, not performing the arrival, arriving. It was almost fall when Carol went back to the university. Not for any reason she could have explained cleanly. She had a client meeting nearby. She had an hour free afterward. She found herself parked in the lot and walking across the main quad without quite deciding to. The way you go back to the places that shaped you when you are not entirely sure why, but your feet already know the direction. The afternoon was amber and cool. October pressing its colors into the edges of things. Students everywhere. The beginning of semester energy. All possibility and anxiety mixed in the same air. The specific mixture of someone arriving somewhere they have chosen and not yet knowing what it will cost them or give them or make of them. She knew that mixture. She had carried it herself. She found the fountain, sat on the same bench. The fountain was unchanged. The light was later in the year, more golden, slanted the way October light slants, coming in at an angle that makes ordinary things look like they are being examined carefully. The bench was just a bench. The concrete below it still faintly warm from the afternoon. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the woman who had sat here in May navy dress. Gold earrings that had been her mother's. A phone call she had almost not taken. A decision she had almost not made. A gray dress she had put back on the hanger and left there. She had walked in that day as herself, not as the ex-wife managing a difficult situation. Not as the woman whose husband had replaced her. Not as the appropriate version or the manageable version or the version that fit the shape of someone else's life. As herself, completely. Besides someone who had decided she was worth standing next to, and the room had shifted. Not because of him. Because of her. She thought about Douglas in the hallway. For the first time in years, you looked exactly like yourself. She had been turning that over for months, not bitterly. With something more like anthropological interest. The way you examine a closed door and wonder about the key. Wonder how it was there all along and you kept walking past it. She had been herself for 3 years before that day. She had been herself quietly, building things, earning things, learning the particular dignity of becoming the person you should have been earlier and not wasting time being angry about the lateness. Something about the graduation had required the full version. She had brought it. That was the whole story. A simple story. The way the most important stories usually are. The Providence engagement was 3 months in. The work was right. She did not have a simpler word for it. The kind of work that uses everything. Every year of making herself small that had built in her an understanding of what it felt like to be lost in language you did not have the tools to decode. Every year of expanding that had built in her the language to bridge it. She had gone to the hospital network's first patient education session, sat in the back of the room while a nurse explained a treatment protocol to 12 patients. She had watched their faces. She had watched the moment the language lost them. She had watched the moment they stopped asking questions, because asking felt like admitting something they were afraid to admit. She had gone back to her team and they had rebuilt the material from the ground up. Not edited, rebuilt. The network's director had called her last week. Her voice had something in it that Carol recognized. The tone of someone who has seen evidence they were not expecting. Patient retention metrics, the director said. In the first month. We have never seen numbers like this, Carol had replied. That is what happens when people can actually understand what you are telling them. She had said it simply, not with pride, with the particular calm of stating something you know to be true because you felt its absence for years in your own life. The co-founder conversations with James were ongoing, patient. Neither of them was in a rush. They had lunch when they were both in the city. Long phone calls at odd hours, both of them in the margins of packed calendars, finding the spaces between things and using them. He had come to her office 2 weeks ago to meet the team. He had sat in the conference room and asked, during the pitch presentation, one question: what does this feel like from the patient's side? Her whole team had loved him. She had watched it happen, watched the room respond to the question, watched her people become more careful and more specific in their answers than they had been before he asked it, watched them rise to what the question asked of them. She had felt something she hadn't felt in years, not just pride in the work, pride in the fullness of her life. The particular feeling of being witnessed not by one person but by the complete version of the life she had built. She had not dated him, not yet, maybe eventually, maybe not. She was done making things happen before they were ready. She was done pressing herself into shapes that required force. She had spent too many years doing exactly that in a marriage that asked her to be smaller, and she had learned that shapes requiring force eventually crack at the seams. For now it was enough that he saw her, that he had been looking at the right moment, not because she had been lucky. Because she had stopped disappearing, she looked at the fountain, thought about something her mother used to say. Her mother, who had outlasted 2 difficult decades and learned to paint watercolors in her 70s and had never once suggested that the learning came easily, who used to say, "The thing about water is it doesn't try to flow, it just does, when you give it room." Carol had given herself room, for the first time in a long time, in a real way. Not the partial room of managing things, not the room that was really just the space left over after everyone else was accommodated. Real room. The kind that requires choosing yourself actively and with some regularity and does not apologize for the choosing. And she was here, in the amber afternoon, by a fountain she had sat at in a navy dress in May, 52 years old, a company with her name on the glass. A son in Chicago doing extraordinary things and calling every Sunday without being asked. A partnership that was going to build something that mattered. A man who had called at 8:30 on a complicated morning and asked her one honest question and let her answer it herself. She was bigger than she had known. She was still finding the edges. Her phone buzzed. "James, are you in the city? I have something to show you. Early interface mock-up for the platform. Rough, but I think you will see what I am seeing." She typed back, "Nearby an hour." 3 dots. Then, "Coffee will be ready." She put the phone away, sat one more moment at the fountain, let it be what it was. A place she had come to on a hard day, where she had sat down as someone arriving and stood up as someone who had arrived. Where she had chosen, without knowing what would come of it, to be the full version of herself instead of the appropriate one, and found out that the full version was what everything had been waiting for. Thank you, she thought. To the day, to the dress, to the phone that rang at 8:30, to the version of herself who had said yes before she could convince herself not to Ruth's hand at the fountain and Ruth's hand in the parking lot, and Ruth's 20 years of steady presence and the coffee that had been refilled in the kitchen with the contained energy of a woman exercising considerable self-restraint. To all of it. She stood, straightened her jacket, the same jacket Ruth had brought to the parking lot that evening in her quiet, steady 20-year way. She looked at the fountain once more. The water moved, the way water moves when you give it room. Then she walked back across the quad, past the students with their whole lives arriving at them, past the oak trees that had been there longer than anyone's story, past the east entrance where the jazz ensemble had played in May, the horns carrying warmth across the crowd noise on a day that had asked everything and given something she had not known to ask for. Past the bench where she had sat, past the fountain, she walked to her car, got in, checked her reflection once. Brief, matter of fact, the same brown eyes, the same small scar on her chin from a bicycle fall when she was 9 years old, the kind of mark that stays with you so long you stop seeing it and then one day you see it again and it is just part of you. Has always been just part of you. Still herself. More herself than she had ever been. She started the engine, drove toward the city, toward the coffee James had already started making, toward the next version of everything. She had learned something in the last year. Something she would have called obvious if you had said it to her before she had lived it. And that she now understood was anything but obvious. Because if it were obvious, she would have known it at 27 and not needed to arrive at it at 52 through the long way around. She had learned that the moment you stop being afraid of your own size is the moment the right people start to see you. Not because you advertised yourself, not because you performed, not because you arrived with someone impressive, or wore the right dress, or said the right thing at the right dinner table, but because you stopped hiding. You wore the color you actually wanted to wear. You answered the phone at 8:30 in the morning when someone asked a question that mattered. You walked into the room as the full, complete, entire version of yourself, not the appropriate one, not the manageable one, not the one that fit the shape of someone else's life. the actual one. And the people who were meant to find you found you, because you were finally there to be found. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, Mom. Connor is applying to grad programs near you. Can he reach out if he needs advice on the application? She smiled at the screen. Type back. Course. Tell him to call anytime. 3 dots. Then you are the best. Also, I need you to teach me the chicken marsala recipe. Properly. Not the freezer version. The real one. And then laughed again because it surprised her. She had stopped counting. She had entirely, completely lost count of the unexpected laughs. She was beginning to understand that was the whole point. She remembered what she used to tell herself during the worst of it. The 3 in the morning, ceiling staring worst of it. The nights the divorce was still fresh and the future was an empty field. And she could not find the shape of what came next, and the shape refused to show itself no matter how long she looked. Hold on until the light changes. She had held on. The light had changed. Not into something brighter, necessarily. Into something more her own. Like a room you have repainted from a color that was someone else's choice into one that belongs to the life you are actually living. The same walls, a different light, everything cleaner for it, everything more visible. She pulled into the parking garage downtown, took the elevator to the 9th floor, corner office. The coffee would be hot. She got out of the car, took the elevator up, walked in, and when he looked up from his desk and said, "Carol Whitfield," right on time, she smiled. Not because he said it, because it was true. She had just been right on time. She had just spent a while learning that arriving was something you did on purpose, that it required the decision, that the decision required you to believe you were worth arriving for. She walked in, she took up the space she was meant to take. She stayed. And one last thing, because the story is done, but the truth in it is not. You have read about a woman who wore gray for 14 years and then chose navy blue, who answered a phone at 8:30 in the morning and said yes, who walked into a room as herself, completely, and felt it shift. That shift did not happen because she had all the right pieces in place. It happened because she showed up, as the real version, on a complicated morning, with her gold earrings and her steady hands and her decision to stop being invisible. The rest followed. Not because the universe rewarded her, not because Douglas finally understood, not because James happened to call, because she was there. To receive it, you have been there, in some version of this. You have worn the gray. You have had the morning where the choice was simple and terrifying at once. Maybe you chose differently then. Maybe you are choosing now. The fountain is still there. The light still changes. You are still yourself. That is where it starts. That is always where it starts.